On April 29, 2013, a wave of car bomb blasts tore through areas south of the capital city, killing at least 36 and deepening fears that the country is spiraling back out of control. The attacks capped a week of turmoil that is posing the greatest test to the country's stability since foreign forces left the country. You might believe that I'm speaking about the broken, violent, and war-torn countries of Afghanistan and Syria, or perhaps the nation of Egypt still plagued by corruption and revolution. However, I'm speaking about a nation where war is supposedly over. I'm speaking, of course, about Iraq. In this segment, we will examine the history of a country known for its instability. Iraq has been a source of conflict in the Middle East since the discovery of oil. Iraq became a republic in 1958. Bordering Iran, Syria, and Saudi Arabia, Iraq is a country dominated by Shiites. In July of 1979, a radical leader, Saddam Hussein, took control of Iraq and immediately made his presence clear. In 1980, Iraq invaded Iran and instigated the Iran-Iraq War, which lasted 8 long years. In 1990, Saddam ordered the invasion of Kuwait and started the first Gulf War, a mere 2 years after the war with Iran ended. In 2003, in an attempt to bring stability to the country, the United States sent troops into Iraq to capture Saddam and take down his regime. Contrary to what the Bush administration believed, the U.S. troops were not treated as liberators. In fact, their occupation of Iraq only increased foreign resentment. U.S. President George Bush's decision to invade Iraq is debatably one of the most controversial military actions in U.S. history. I'm A.J. Abrevaya.
I'm Peter Zaharchuk.
And I'm Victoria Morrow.
We're here to analyze the real history of Iraq and tell you where the country's heading. And this is 15 minutes.
It is impossible to exaggerate the significant impact of colonial exploitation on the nation of Iraq. Foreign influence has dramatically defined the manner in which the social, economic, and political foundations of the country have evolved during the course of the 20th century. After World War I, the Sykes-Picot Agreement resulted in British mandates, which gave them unprecedented influence in this oil-rich country. They took full advantage of Iraq's enormous natural resources, especially its oil. In 1921, after the Cairo Conference, where Faisal was appointed as the king, Iraq became an officially recognized state in the Middle East, but it still remained under British control. Ethnic strife continued to cause domestic turmoil throughout the country during the period between the world wars. Britain tried to maintain their sphere of influence, especially because stability in Iraq would ensure access to oil, which was crucial to the British war effort in World War II. After the war, ethnic tensions between the Shia and Sunni parties caused enormous tension and turmoil, threatening British influence. When Iraq tried to nationalize its oil resources in the early 1970s, the CIA supported a coup that brought Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party to power. Today, colonial exploitation still continues with the occupation of Iraq's biggest oil field, Rumaila, by British Petroleum. According to Times Magazine, BP's takeover of Rumaila is highly unpopular with the local politicians invoking resentful memories of their nation's colonial past. While the citizens of Iraq believe that Britain invaded Iraq in the name of democracy, the true motives of Britain were hidden from the Iraqi people by their own government. The Western powers continue to show interest in claiming their share of Iraqi oil in the Iraqi Constitution of 2000. It was written under American advisors and guarantees foreign oil companies a stake in Iraq's oil. This form of diplomatic colonial exploitation shows the true extent of exploitation in Iraq. Until the oil fields of Iraq dry up or oil becomes obsolete, the exploitation will happen time after time.
Iraq had always had the reputation in the Middle East for being one of the most stable countries with a flourishing economy. However, over the years, Iraq has had a series of conflicts within the Middle East contributing to their economic ruin. This all began with the Iran-Iraq War in the late 20th century. The Iran-Iraq War began in September 1980 and lasted until August 1988. Iraq invaded Iran by air and by land on September 22, 1980. The invasion was instigated by Saddam Hussein's fear that the Iranian Revolution of 1979 would inspire his people to turn against him. Iraq started the war on the offensive, but after only 2 years, Iran pushed them back. For the next 6 years, Iraq was on the defensive. The shame that the Iraqi people experienced after losing the war that they started caused them to experience a poverty of dignity. The war ended in 1988 with a ceasefire from the UN. In the Iran-Iraq War, Saddam used chemical weapons against both Iran and his own people. This is part of the reason why the United States thought Iraq had weapons of mass destruction in 2003 and invaded to take down Saddam's regime. By 1988, the Iraqi army was the fourth largest army in the world. Saddam's forces invaded Kuwait on August 2, 1990. This invasion led straight to the Gulf Wars. The Gulf Wars lasted from August 1990 until February of 1991. It was codenamed Operation Desert Storm. It was a war waged by the UN against Saddam's invasion of Kuwait on August 2, 1990. The invasion of Kuwait by Iraqi troops was met by international scrutiny and economic sanctions against both Iraq by UN members. In 1991, the United States President George H.W. Bush took action and sent troops over to Saudi Arabia to push Saddam's forces back out of Kuwait.
Saddam Hussein came to Iraqi power in 1979 and often used methods of torture to maintain control within the country. He continued the Ba'ath Party's campaign to attack the Kurds. During the 1980s, the Kurds attempted to sneak attack while the Iraqi forces were busy fighting with Iran. Saddam Hussein responded by using chemical weapons. In 1988, Saddam released lethal chemical weapons on the town of Halabja, where 40,000 to 50,000 people were living. Rebel villages were known as prohibited areas in which the Iraqis were instructed to kill every living thing. The Iraqi government believed that the Kurds gaining independence would encourage the Shiites to do the same, damaging Iraq as a country. As a result, they tried to prevent Kurdish uprisings by executing extremely cruel actions, leaving the Kurds culturally and politically discriminated. Kurdish and Iraqi militaries fought in 1978 and 1979. The Iraqis defeated the Kurdish guerrilla fighters after destroying 600 Kurdish villages and displacing 200,000 Kurds into sporadic places to prevent more uprisings. Even now, the Iraqi government is continuing to commit awful offenses against human rights. In the 2012 State Department Human Rights Report, there were many cases of human rights defiance. Included in these offenses are unlawful killings, torture, denial of fair public trials, arbitrary arrest, limits of freedom of speech, human trafficking, limited exercise of labor rights, and corrupted government. However, even though the Iraqi government is full of flaws, it is democratically elected. Even peaceful protests are responded to in a violent, threatening manner, often resulting in arrests. In August 2011, a journalist rights law was passed to protect journalists from offenses of the corrupted government. However, the law did not overrule the libel and defamation laws that were still existent from Saddam's rule. This meant that journalists could be imprisoned for writing about the corruption in the government or publicly insulting the government. Saddam's laws for labor are still in place from 1978. The death penalty is legal in Iraq and is often the result of terrorism and other charges.
While most perceptions of the United States' relationship with Iraq only started with the Iraq War after September 11, 2001, there are other crucial parts to the U.S.'s relationship with Iraq that must be understood. A substantial part in the relationship with Iraq was during the Iran-Iraq War. The United States formed an unholy alliance with Iraq to defeat Iran. They supplied chemical weapons to Saddam Hussein to use against the Iranian soldiers, but he also used them against his own people. The United States switched their position with Iraq in the 1990s during the first Gulf War when Iraq invaded Kuwait. The United States drove them back into Iraq and squashed the attack. The U.S. changed its side many times with Iraq, whether to support it or announce it as a threat to the world and their allies. One reason for this diplomatic flip-flopping might lay in the ground. The Western powers of the USA and Britain along with many other countries, had become completely dependent on oil. This has forced them to forge friendly or not so friendly relationships in the oil-rich Middle Eastern countries of Iraq, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. Iraq is home to some of the largest oil reserves in the world. It is the country's main source of income and is their top exported good. This will remain the case for years to come until an effective alternative to crude oil is discovered. Any decision the U.S. makes regarding the Middle East must always have the importance of oil in their mind.
When President George W. Bush announced the invasion of Iraq in 2003, the idea sold to the American people was that Iraq held weapons of mass destruction and was an imminent threat to the U.S. and their allies in the Middle East.
The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa.
The Bush administration told the American people that the war was to last fewer than 6 months, cost less than $60 billion, and have very little loss of American life. They were lied to. The war, lasting almost a decade, cost $3 trillion taxpayer dollars and took 5,000 U.S. lives. After the September 11th attacks, the country was ravenous for revenge on al-Qaeda, who claimed responsibility for the attacks. Rumors floated around the U.S. that there were ties to al-Qaeda in Iraq. This was enough to get the people behind the invasion. The government did not say that the rumors were true, but never said that they weren't. The government took advantage of the American patriotism to gain approval for the war. The Iraq War was not an intelligence war. The intelligence collected was faulty at best. U.S. Representative Patrick Murphy even said that it showed the government's reckless arrogance. WMDs that the U.S. and other Western powers supplied to the Iraqis a decade earlier had been used or destroyed. The CIA and other intelligence agencies found no traces that any chemical or biological weapons were in production, and in fact, Saddam Hussein's son-in-law, Hussein Kamal Hassan al-Majid, stated that the programs had failed and were terminated. Another faulty source of intelligence was Curveball, a German intelligence officer who was found incredible by the CIA. He told them that Saddam had mobile weapons of mass destruction laboratories when in fact he did not. Also cited in the pitch to declare war on Iraq, the story of yellow cake uranium being delivered to Iraq was never believed by the CIA. This story was a main source of evidence in the UN's decision to approve the invasion of Iraq. The government made a significant error in their decision to go to war on faulty evidence, and the lives of many thousands of Americans were taken because of it.
When the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, they took down Saddam's regime, leaving the country in ruins. Saddam had been waging war and using his large army to instill fear throughout the Middle East for most of the late 20th century. By weakening Iraq, a major force in the Middle East, the United States indirectly strengthened the nation of Iran. Iraq was also ruled by Saddam's Ba'ath Party, but after he was deposed, Iraq became a party dominated by Shia. Since Iran is also a Shia ruling party, they now have political leverage in Iraq. Iran was the real winner in 2003 invasion because they no longer have to deal with the effects of Saddam Hussein's radical decisions, and they now have the influence in Iraq government.
The U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the overthrow of Saddam Hussein has affected the relations between Iraq and Iran by improving an unpredictable and tension-filled relationship into a calmer and more stable relationship. When Saddam Hussein was in power, he attacked Iran to start the Iran-Iraq War and used chemical weapons on Iranian soldiers. This long war lasted 8 years, and tensions between these two countries reached an all-time high. The relationship was severely damaged from this war, but has significantly changed after Saddam Hussein was overthrown. Now, Iran plays a huge part in the reconstruction of Iraq because Iran has offered its help economically and militarily to help stabilize the country. As of January 2010, the two countries have signed more than 100 economic and cooperation agreements. Iraq imports items such as cars, construction materials, medicine, fruits and spices, and fish from Iran. Each month, more than 40,000 Iranians visit Shiite holy places such as Najaf and Karbala in Iraq. In both countries, relations between Iraq and Iran have improved drastically since 2003 and have become more important to each other economically, politically, and socially.
Post-Saddam Iraq is a weak democracy, and although there has been change in government, aspects of Saddam's regime have returned after the U.S. military withdrawal. The previously reigning Sunni Muslims are shocked at the dramatic change in life between when Saddam was in power and now. The supposed winners of the Iraq War were the Shiite Muslims, and when asked about the current quality of life in Iran for the Shiites, Trudy Rubin, journalist for the Philadelphia Inquirer, replied that, quote, "Many Shiites are extremely disappointed that Saddam's fall has not brought them better lives," end quote. This internal strife continues between the different religious factions in Iraq, and all parties believe that they are in the right. As indicated by Kenneth Katzman, specialist in Middle Eastern affairs at the Congressional Research Service, quote, "Disputes on power and economic resources muted during the last years of the U.S. military presence have reemerged since mid-2012 and threatened to return Iraq to a period of sectarian conflict," end quote. The inter-Iraq scuffle poses a serious threat to the country as a whole, and it threatens to divide the country and topple the democracy that has been in the making for almost a decade.
I'm Andy Rooney. This was 15 Minutes. Thanks for watching and good night.